Blood stained the hem of Beatrice Robertson's dress as she stumbled through the moonlit streets of St. Elmo, Colorado, clutching nothing but a small leather pouch and the bitter knowledge that by sunrise, her stepfather would discover she hadn't died in that cellar after all. April 1882 had brought an early spring to the Rocky Mountains, but the night air still carried winter's bite. Beatrice pulled her thin shawl tighter as she limped past the darkened storefronts. The mining town slept, unaware of her desperate flight, unaware that just hours ago, Vernon Robertson had declared his stepdaughter dead, collected her inheritance, and celebrated by getting drunk enough to forget he'd locked the cellar door. Beatrice's mother had died 3 months prior, leaving behind a modest but respectable sum and their family home to her only daughter. The ink had barely dried on the will before Vernon revealed his true nature, a gambler and a drunk who'd married her mother solely for the prospect of eventual wealth. When Beatrice refused to sign over her inheritance, Vernon's charming facade cracked completely. She touched the bruise flowering on her cheekbone. The pain sparked fresh determination as she reached the edge of town. There was nothing left for her here. Her home, her mother's jewelry, even the small teaching position she'd secured at the local schoolhouse all gone. Vernon had systematically stripped everything away while the town looked on, believing his tales of her fragile constitution and delicate mind. Dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks when Beatrice collapsed beside a stream 2 miles outside of town. Her thin boots were worn through, her dark hair falling loose from its pins. She dipped her hands into the icy water and washed the blood from her fingers where she'd fought to pry open the cellar window. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. "Whoa there, midnight," a deep voice called as a horse nickered nearby. Beatrice scrambled behind a boulder, peering out as a tall figure dismounted from a magnificent black stallion. The man wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, his dark hat pulled low over his brow. A cowboy, judging by his boots and the easy way he moved, like a man accustomed to long days in the saddle. He knelt by the stream, filling a canteen, and Beatrice tried to retreat further, but her foot dislodged a stone that clattered down the embankment. The man's head snapped up, hand instantly moving to the holster at his hip. "Who's there?" he called, voice steady. "Show yourself." Beatrice considered running but knew she'd never outpace him. Slowly, she stepped out from her hiding place, chin raised despite her disheveled appearance. The cowboy's eyes widened slightly. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than 30. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly fine," Beatrice lied, even as she swayed on her feet. The man's gaze traveled over her torn dress, the bruise on her face, and her mudded boots. His expression darkened. "My name's Wade Vance," he said, making no move toward her. "I've got coffee brewing at my camp just yonder. You're welcome to a cup if you'd like." Beatrice hesitated. Her mother had raised her to be cautious around strangers, especially men, but her mother was gone, and Beatrice had nowhere to go, no plan beyond putting distance between herself and Vernon. "I'm Beatrice Robertson," she said finally, "and I would appreciate that coffee, Mr. Vance." Wade's campsite was neat and minimal, a small fire, a bedroll and saddlebags propped against a fallen log. He moved with deliberate slowness, as if understanding she might bolt like a frightened deer. The coffee he poured into a tin cup was strong and hot, and Beatrice cradled it in her cold hands gratefully. "You running from something, Miss Robertson?" he asked after she'd taken a few sips. Beatrice stiffened. "What makes you say that?" Wade gestured vaguely toward her. "Most ladies don't wander the wilderness at dawn wearing evening clothes." She glanced down at her once pretty blue dress, now torn and stained. It had been her best, the one Vernon had insisted she wear to the banker's dinner where he'd announced their plans to sell the house. "Yes," she admitted. "I'm running, my stepfather." Her voice faltered. "He took everything. My mother's house, my inheritance. When I confronted him, he locked me in the cellar, said he'd tell everyone I'd run off or perhaps that I'd taken ill and died." Wade's expression remained neutral, but his eyes a striking green hardened. "And you escaped, through a window." Beatrice's voice cracked. "I have nothing left, nowhere to go. You got away with your life," Wade said quietly. "That's not nothing." The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. He was right. Vernon had intended for her to die in that cellar, either from starvation or when he eventually returned to ensure her silence permanently. "Where you headed?" Wade asked, pouring her more coffee. "I don't know. Denver, perhaps. Or further east." In truth, Beatrice hadn't thought beyond escape. Wade nodded thoughtfully. "I'm driving cattle to a ranch near Silver Cliff. It's about 3 days' ride from here." He paused. "I could use some help with the cooking and the pay's fair." Beatrice looked up sharply. "You're offering me a job, temporarily," Wade clarified, "just until we reach Silver Cliff. After that, the ranch owner might have work for you, or you could continue on to wherever you're headed." Suspicion bloomed. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Something like pain flickered across Wade's face before he masked it. "Let's just say I know what it's like to have everything taken away," he said. "My father used to say a helping hand costs nothing to extend but means everything to receive." Beatrice studied him. Wade Vance was a stranger, true, but her instincts told her he wasn't like Vernon. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet strength that didn't feel threatening. "These cattle you mentioned," she said. "Where are they?" Wade smiled slightly, the expression transforming his serious face. "About a half-mile back. 20 head I'm delivering to the Castle Rock Ranch." Beatrice considered her options, which were painfully few. She could continue alone with no money and no real destination, or she could accept this temporary arrangement. "I'm not much of a cook," she admitted. "Can you boil coffee and fry bacon?" "Yes." "Then you're qualified," Wade said, standing and offering her his hand. "What do you say, Miss Robertson? Want to try your hand at being a cowboy's cook?" Beatrice looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and strong. 3 days ago, she'd been a respectable young woman with a future. Now she was battered and homeless, with nothing but the clothes on her back. Yet somehow, here in this mountain clearing with this quiet cowboy, she felt the first stirring of something she'd thought Vernon had extinguished completely: hope. She took his hand. "I accept, Mr. Vance." Wade's herd was indeed small 20 longhorn cattle, with wide, impressive horns that made Beatrice nervous as she rode alongside them on a gentle mare Wade called Daisy. He'd offered her his bedroll, insisting he was fine with just his saddle blanket, and had even produced a worn flannel shirt and canvas trousers from his pack that she could change into. "They belonged to my sister," he explained, handing her the neatly folded clothes. "She's back in Texas now with her husband." "You're from Texas originally?" Beatrice asked, grateful for the clothes despite their masculine cut. Wade nodded. "Born and raised near San Antonio, came to Colorado 5 years ago." He didn't elaborate, and Beatrice didn't press. She'd learned that Wade Vance wasn't a talkative man, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. They traveled slowly, the pace of the cattle dictating their progress. Beatrice was grateful for the leisurely ride, as it gave her battered body time to recover. By the second day, the worst of her dizziness had subsided, though the bruises on her face had darkened to a vivid purple. Wade never mentioned them, but she often caught him looking at her with an expression that mingled concern and something darker, anger, perhaps, though not directed at her. He was unfailingly polite, keeping a respectful distance around camp and teaching her without condescension how to manage their small cooking fire. On the third night, as they sat before the campfire with the stars spread like diamonds above them, Wade finally asked the question she'd been dreading. "Your stepfather, will he come looking for you?" Beatrice stared into the flames. "Perhaps, not out of concern, but because I—" She hesitated, then reached into the small leather pouch she kept tucked inside her borrowed shirt. From it, she withdrew a gold band set with 3 small sapphires. "This was my mother's. The only thing I managed to hide before Vernon took everything else. He'll want it back." "It's yours by right," Wade said firmly. "Your mother left it to you. Vernon doesn't see it that way." Beatrice twisted the ring in her fingers. "He believes everything my mother owned became his upon marriage." Wade's jaw tightened. "The law doesn't support that view, especially not with a will in place." "The law," Beatrice said bitterly, "requires evidence and witnesses. Vernon has the town banker convinced I'm unstable, and the sheriff." She swallowed hard. "Sheriff Daniels and Vernon play poker together twice a week." Wade's green eyes reflected the firelight as he studied her. So you ran with no destination in mind, just to get away, wouldn't you? She challenged. Yes, he said simply. I did. Beatrice waited, sensing there was more to that statement, but Wade had turned his attention to stoking the fire. She was learning that this was his way, offering small pieces of himself, but never the whole story. Silver Cliff has a decent sheriff, Wade said eventually. Man named Hollister. Fair-minded if you wanted to report what happened. Beatrice shook her head. And say what, that my stepfather is a thief. Without proof, it would be his word against mine. She slipped the ring back into its pouch. No, I need to start over. Find work, save money. Perhaps someday I'll have enough to challenge him legally, but for now. For now, you focus on staying alive and free, Wade finished for her. Exactly. They fell silent, the crackling fire and the occasional lowing of cattle the only sounds in the vast Colorado night. What will you do in Silver Cliff? Wade asked finally. After our arrangement ends, Beatrice had been pondering this question herself. I was a teacher in St. Elmo, she said. Perhaps I could find similar work. Wade nodded. The town's growing, they might need educators. He paused. The ranch owner, Sawyer, is a good man, has a daughter about 10 years old who's being taught by his housekeeper, but he's mentioned wanting a proper teacher. Hope fluttered in Beatrice's chest. Do you think he'd consider me? Without references, my recommendation carries weight with Sawyer, Wade said, and he's not one to judge a person by their circumstances. Beatrice looked at him curiously. You've worked for him long. Off and on for 4 years, he gave me a chance when. Wade trailed off, then seemed to come to a decision. When I needed one, after I lost my ranch in Texas. It was the most personal information he'd offered since they'd met, and Beatrice sensed the significance of the disclosure. How did you lose it? She asked gently. Wade's face hardened. Cattle Baron wanted my land. When I wouldn't sell, he found other ways to take it. The parallel to her own situation wasn't lost on Beatrice. I'm sorry. Wade shrugged, but the casualness of the gesture was belied by the tension in his shoulders. It was a long time ago. Not so long that it doesn't still hurt, Beatrice observed softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain, of understanding that went beyond words. No, he agreed quietly, not so long. The moment stretched between them, intimate despite the open air and the distance they maintained around the fire. Then Wade cleared his throat and stood. Dawn comes early, he said. We should get some rest. Beatrice nodded, knowing the conversation had ended for now. But as she settled into her bedroll and watched Wade take his position on the opposite side of the fire, she felt a curious warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. For the first time since her mother's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning brought rain, a steady, cold drizzle that turned the trail muddy and made the cattle restless. Beatrice pulled the wide-brimmed hat Wade had given her lower over her face, grateful for its protection even as water dripped from its edges. We're about 10 miles from Silver Cliff, Wade called over the patter of raindrops. Should make it by nightfall if the weather doesn't worsen. Beatrice nodded, trying to ignore how her borrowed clothes clung uncomfortably to her skin. Despite the discomfort, there was something freeing about riding through the wilderness, away from the stifling confines of town life and its judgments. Out here, with Wade and the cattle, she wasn't the poor orphaned daughter or the madwoman Vernon had portrayed her as. She was simply Beatrice, cold, wet, but undeniably alive. By midday, the rain had intensified, forcing them to seek shelter in a stand of pines. Wade quickly established a makeshift camp, rigging a tarpaulin between trees to create a dry space. The cattle huddled nearby, seemingly content to pause their journey. This might pass quickly, Wade said, though he didn't sound convinced, but we should prepare to stay put for a while. Beatrice nodded, wringing water from her long dark hair. I'll see about lunch. Working together, they managed to start a small fire in the shelter of a rock overhang. The coffee was weaker than usual due to the rain contaminating their supply, but the warmth was welcome. They sat close together under the tarpaulin, watching the gray curtain of rain. Tell me about Silver Cliff, Beatrice said, partly from curiosity and partly to distract herself from their proximity. Wade smelled of leather and horses and pine, a combination she was finding increasingly pleasant. "It's larger than St. Elmo," he said. "Became a silver mining town about 5 years ago. Sawyer's Ranch is a few miles outside town. He raises cattle and horses, mostly for the mining companies. And his daughter, what's she like?" Wade's expression softened. "Emma, smart as a whip, wild as these mountains. Her mother died when she was born, so she's been raised by Sawyer and his housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. No other family, none nearby. Sawyer's sister visits from Denver occasionally, but she's not the maternal type." Wade glanced at Beatrice. "Emma could use a woman's influence. Someone patient, educated." Beatrice felt a pang of longing. She'd loved teaching at St. Elmo's small school, loved watching children's faces light up with understanding. "I hope Mr. Sawyer will consider me," she said quietly. "He will," Wade assured her with a confidence that bolstered her spirits. The rain continued throughout the afternoon, eventually settling into a light but persistent drizzle. They decided to remain where they were for the night rather than risk the muddy trails in diminishing light. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. Beatrice tried not to shiver, but her damp clothes made it impossible to get warm, even huddled close to the fire, Wade noticed. Without comment, he retrieved a heavy woolen blanket from his saddlebag, one that had somehow remained dry, and draped it around her shoulders. "What about you?" she protested. "I'm used to the cold," he said dismissively, though she noticed him pull his collar higher. Beatrice hesitated, then lifted one side of the blanket. "We could share," she suggested, her cheeks warming despite the chill. "For practicality's sake." Wade looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Then, with deliberate movements, he settled beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance even as they shared the blanket's warmth. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. Beatrice nodded, acutely aware of his solid presence beside her. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain and the occasional pop of the fire. "My father was a rancher," she said eventually, the words emerging unexpectedly. "He died when I was 12. Mother remarried when I was 16 to Vernon." She stared into the flames. "He was charming at first, attentive to Mother. I was away at school most of the time, so I didn't see." She swallowed. "I didn't see how he changed once they were married, how he isolated her from friends, how he began gambling away her savings." Wade listened silently, his stillness encouraging her to continue. "When I returned home after finishing school, Mother was different, quieter. Vernon controlled everything, the money, who she spoke to, where she went." Beatrice's hands clenched beneath the blanket. "She died of pneumonia, but I sometimes think she simply lost the will to fight. And then he turned his attention to you," Wade said softly. "Yes, he expected me to be as compliant as Mother had become when I wasn't." She touched her bruised cheek unconsciously. "Well, you can see his methods of persuasion." Anger flashed in Wade's eyes. "Men like that," he said, voice tight, "they're cowards at heart. They only feel strong when making others feel weak. You sound like you have experience with such men. The cattle baron I mentioned, Harrison Blake. He didn't just want my land. He wanted to crush me, make an example of me." Wade's jaw tightened. "When legal threats didn't work, he sent men to poison my water supply. My cattle started dying, then my horses. The bank called in loans I couldn't repay." "That's terrible," Beatrice whispered. "I fought back at first," Wade continued, "but Blake had judges and lawmakers in his pocket. Eventually, I lost everything." His voice grew distant. "My father built that ranch from nothing, died defending it during a raid, and I couldn't keep it." Without thinking, Beatrice placed her hand on his arm. "It wasn't your fault." Wade looked down at her hand, then met her eyes. Something shifted in his gaze, a softening, a vulnerability he hadn't shown before. "Nor is what happened to you your fault," he said quietly. The simple absolution brought tears to Beatrice's eyes. She'd been carrying a weight of shame, wondering if she could have somehow prevented Vernon's actions, if she'd failed her mother by not seeing the truth sooner. Wade hesitantly raised his hand and, with infinite gentleness, brushed a tear from her cheek, carefully avoiding her bruise. "We should get some rest," he said, though he made no move to withdraw from their shared warmth. Beatrice nodded, suddenly exhausted. The emotional release of sharing her story had drained her remaining energy. That night, She fell asleep with the steady sound of Wade's breathing beside her, his presence a silent promise of safety in the wilderness. For the first time since fleeing St. Elmo, Beatrice slept without nightmares. Morning brought clearing skies and renewed purpose. They broke camp efficiently, neither mentioning the intimacy of the previous night's conversation. Yet something had changed between them, a trust had formed, fragile but real. By mid-afternoon, they crested a hill and Silver Cliff came into view, nestled in a valley with mountains rising behind it. The town was indeed larger than St. Elmo, with a proper main street lined with businesses and a church spire visible above the rooftops. Castle Rock Ranch is about 2 miles beyond town, Wade explained as they guided the cattle down the slope. We'll skirt around Silver Cliff rather than drive the herd through. Beatrice nodded, trying to ignore the anxiety building in her stomach. Their journey was ending, and with it, the strange, suspended reality she'd inhabited these past days. Soon she would have to face new people, explain her presence, find work, all while looking over her shoulder for Vernon. As if sensing her thoughts, Wade said, "Sawyer won't turn you away. At worst, you can stay at the ranch until you decide your next move." "Thank you," Beatrice said, meaning it for far more than just his reassurance. The Castle Rock Ranch was impressive, a sprawling main house built of solid timber and stone, surrounded by well-maintained outbuildings and corrals. As they approached with the cattle, a man emerged from the barn, followed by a young girl with flaming red hair. "Wade," the girl called, running toward them with abandon. "You're back," Wade dismounted with a smile wider than any Beatrice had yet seen from him. "Miss Emma," he greeted, tipping his hat formally before the girl launched herself into his arms. He swung her around once before setting her down. "Who's that?" Emma asked bluntly, pointing at Beatrice. "Emma, mind your manners," the man, presumably Sawyer, admonished as he approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a beard shot through with gray despite his relatively young age. "This is Miss Beatrice Robertson," Wade introduced. "She's been helping me with the drive. Miss Robertson, this is Howard Sawyer and his daughter Emma." Beatrice inclined her head, suddenly self-conscious of her borrowed men's clothing and her still visible bruises. Sawyer's eyes took in her appearance with a quick, assessing glance, but his expression remained neutral. "Welcome to Castle Rock, Miss Robertson. Any friend of Wade's is welcome here." "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer," she replied, relieved at the lack of probing questions. "Wade said he was bringing 20 head of prime beef cattle," Emma announced. "Did you help drive them, Miss Robertson? Can you ride like a cowboy? Why is your face all purple?" Emma. Sawyer's reprimand was sharper this time. Beatrice found herself smiling despite her discomfort. "It's all right. Yes, I helped with the cattle, though Mr. Vance did most of the work. I can ride, but not like a cowboy, and I had an accident before we left St. Elmo." The explanation seemed to satisfy the girl, though Sawyer's gaze sharpened at the obvious lie about her injuries. "Emma, go tell Mrs. Finch we have guests for dinner," Sawyer said. When his daughter had dashed off, he turned to Wade. "Trouble?" Wade glanced at Beatrice, silently asking permission. When she nodded slightly, he said, "Miss Robertson needed to leave St. Elmo quickly. Her stepfather was unkind." The understatement hung in the air, but Sawyer seemed to understand what wasn't being said. He nodded once, decision made. "We've plenty of room in the main house," he said. "And we could use a hand with the accounts if you've any head for numbers, Miss Robertson." "I do," Beatrice confirmed, relief washing through her. "I kept the books for my mother's household and assisted with record keeping at the school where I taught." "A teacher," Sawyer's eyebrows rose. "Now that is interesting. Emma's been pestering me about proper schooling." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Why don't we get you settled and we can discuss possibilities after dinner?" As they walked toward the house, Beatrice fell into step beside Wade. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" He asked. "For bringing me here, for believing me, for not." She struggled to articulate the depth of her gratitude. Wade's hand briefly touched the small of her back, a fleeting gesture of support. "You would have found your way without me," he said, "but I'm glad I could help." The Castle Rock Ranch house was comfortable without being ostentatious, clearly the home of a successful man who valued practicality over show. Mrs. Finch, a stout woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, showed Beatrice to a small but pleasant bedroom on the second floor. "There's fresh water in the pitcher," she said, gesturing to a washstand. "And I'll have some proper clothes brought up for you shortly. Mr. Sawyer's sister leaves things behind when she visits should be near your size." "That's very kind," Beatrice said, overwhelmed by the unexpected hospitality. Mrs. Finch patted her arm. "Any friend of Wade's is a friend of ours, dear. That man saved Mr. Sawyer's life during a cattle stampede 3 years back. He doesn't bring many people around, so when he does, we take notice." After the housekeeper left, Beatrice sank onto the edge of the bed, emotion welling in her throat. Just days ago, she'd been locked in a cellar, certain she would die. Now she was being offered clothes, shelter, and possibly employment by strangers who seemed to want nothing in return. She washed thoroughly, wincing as she discovered bruises she hadn't even been aware of. When Mrs. Finch returned with a simple blue dress and underthings, Beatrice nearly wept with gratitude. Dinner was a lively affair, with Emma peppering Beatrice with questions about teaching and Wade with tales of their journey. Sawyer mostly observed, occasionally redirecting his daughter's more intrusive inquiries with gentle firmness. After the meal, when Emma had been sent to bed despite vocal protests, Sawyer invited Beatrice and Wade to his study, a wood-paneled room lined with books and maps. "So," he said, pouring 3 glasses of whiskey and handing them around, "Wade tells me you're in need of a fresh start, Miss Robertson." Beatrice took a small sip of the whiskey, welcoming its burn. "Yes, sir. And you were a teacher in St. Elmo, for 2 years, yes." "Before that, I attended Miss Porter's school in Connecticut." Sawyer nodded approvingly. "A fine institution. My late wife was educated there." He studied Beatrice over his glass. "I've been considering hiring a proper teacher for Emma and perhaps some of the children from neighboring ranches. Mrs. Finch has done her best, but her own education was limited." Hope rose in Beatrice's chest. "I would be very interested in such a position, Mr. Sawyer." "The pay wouldn't match what you might earn in a town school," he cautioned, "but it would include room and board here at the ranch." "That sounds more than fair," Beatrice said quickly. Sawyer smiled slightly. "You haven't heard the worst part yet. Emma is spirited. She's run off 2 tutors already." "Mr. Sawyer," Beatrice said, finding confidence despite her circumstances, "I once taught 15 children of various ages in a one-room schoolhouse during a blizzard that lasted 3 days. I believe I can manage one spirited girl." Wade made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Sawyer didn't bother hiding his amusement. "Well then," he said, raising his glass, "let's consider this a trial arrangement. You'll teach Emma, help with the ranch accounts, and we'll see how things progress." His expression grew more serious. "And if your stepfather comes looking, he'll find the ranch hands of Castle Rock very protective of their own." The implication was clear and deeply comforting. Beatrice blinked rapidly to dispel the threat of tears. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer." Later, as Wade walked her back to her room, Beatrice felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. Their journey had ended, and with it, the constant companionship they'd shared. "Will you be staying at the ranch?" she asked as they paused outside her door. "For a few days," Wade replied. "Then I'm headed north to pick up more cattle for Sawyer." Disappointment settled in Beatrice's stomach. "I see." Wade seemed to hesitate, studying her face in the lamplight. "I'll be back," he said finally. "I always return to Castle Rock. It's the closest thing to home I have now." The simple admission warmed her. "Then I'll look forward to your return, Mr. Vance." He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his solemn features. "Wade," he corrected. "After sharing a campfire for days, I think we're beyond formalities, don't you?" "Wade," she agreed, savoring the feel of his name. "And I'm Beatrice, not Miss Robertson." "Beatrice," he repeated softly. Then, with a gentleness that made her heart stutter, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, brushing a kiss across her knuckles. "Sleep well." She watched him walk away, her hand tingling where his lips had touched. For the first time since her flight from St. Elmo, Beatrice felt something beyond fear and uncertainty, a flicker of anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm unlike anything Beatrice had experienced before. Mornings were devoted to Emma's education in a small room Sawyer had converted into a schoolhouse, complete with a blackboard and 2 additional desks for the Hernandez children from the neighboring ranch. Afternoons found Beatrice helping with the ranch accounts or assisting Mrs. Finch with household tasks. Emma, for all Sawyer's warnings, proved to be a bright and eager student once Beatrice discovered the key to engaging her practical application of knowledge. Mathematics lessons involved calculating feed quantities for the horses, while history focused on the colorful past of Colorado's mining towns. "You're the first teacher who doesn't treat me like I'm stupid just because I ask why we need to learn something," Emma declared one morning after successfully completing a complex division problem. "Questioning is how we learn," Beatrice replied, pleased by the girl's progress. "And you, Miss Emma, have a first-rate mind." The praise made the child beam, her freckled face alight with pride. Wade had departed as planned, riding north with 2 ranch hands to purchase cattle from a rancher near Denver. Before leaving, he'd spent time showing Beatrice around the property, teaching her to identify poisonous plants and where to find the best wild berries. These quiet excursions, away from the bustle of ranch life, had allowed their friendship to deepen. Wade remained reserved, but increasingly, Beatrice caught glimpses of humor and warmth beneath his stoic exterior. "I'll be back within a month," he'd promised the morning he left, his green eyes holding hers. "Try not to let Emma talk you into anything too dangerous while I'm gone." Beatrice had laughed, though her heart felt unexpectedly heavy at his departure. "I make no promises. She's already convinced me that every young lady should know how to ride astride." Wade had smiled, the expression now becoming more frequent. "That's actually not a bad skill to have out here." Then, with a tip of his hat and a last lingering look, he'd ridden away. Now, 3 weeks into his absence, Beatrice found herself watching the northern trail whenever she had a free moment, anticipation fluttering in her chest at the thought of his return. "You've got it bad, Mrs. Finch commented one afternoon, catching Beatrice staring out the kitchen window. "I don't know what you mean," Beatrice protested, feeling her cheeks warm. The housekeeper snorted. "Wade Vance is a fine man, but about as forthcoming as a desert tortoise. Don't expect flowery declarations." "I don't expect anything," Beatrice said truthfully. "Mr. Vance Wade helped me when I desperately needed it. That's all." Mrs. Finch gave her a knowing look, but didn't press further. That evening, as Beatrice sat on the porch helping Emma with a particularly difficult reading passage, the sound of approaching horses made them both look up. "Wade," Emma exclaimed, abandoning her book and leaping to her feet. Beatrice's heart quickened as she spotted the familiar figure leading a small herd of cattle toward the ranch, 2 cowboys flanking the animals. Wade rode tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the setting sun. Emma was already running down the path, waving wildly. Beatrice followed at a more measured pace, though it took considerable restraint not to hurry. Wade dismounted in one fluid motion, catching Emma's exuberant greeting with a laugh. Then his eyes found Beatrice, and something in his expression a softening, a brightness made her breath catch. "You're back early," she said when she reached them, aiming for casual but hearing the pleasure in her own voice. "Got lucky," Wade replied, his eyes not leaving hers. "Rancher had more cattle ready than expected, so we finished our business faster. And Beatrice has been teaching me so much." Emma interjected. "I can multiply fractions now, and I know all about the Homestead Act, and she's letting me read Little Women even though Mrs. Finch says I'm too young." Wade raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like you've been busy," he said to Beatrice. "Your student is a quick learner," she replied. They might have continued standing there, regarding each other with barely concealed pleasure, if Sawyer hadn't emerged from the barn. "Good to see you back, Vance," he called. "Bring those cattle in and get settled. Mrs. Finch has beef stew that'll make you forget every mile of hard riding." The spell broken, Wade nodded and turned to his work, though not before one more glance at Beatrice, a look that promised a continuation of their greeting later. Dinner that night was a celebration of the successful cattle drive. The 2 ranch hands who had accompanied Wade brothers named Thomas and Joseph Carter joined them at the table, filling the room with tales of their journey. Wade spoke little, as was his way, but Beatrice noticed how the others deferred to him, seeking his confirmation of details or his opinion on matters raised. After the meal, when Emma had reluctantly gone to bed and the Carter brothers had retired to the bunkhouse, Sawyer invited Wade and Beatrice to join him for a nightcap on the porch. "The herd looks good, Vance," Sawyer said, lighting a cigar. "Worth every penny, I'd say." Wade nodded. "Peterson knows his stock, treated us fair on the price, too." "And no trouble on the trail?" Sawyer's question seemed casual, but Beatrice detected an undercurrent. "None," Wade said, though there was talk in Denver about Blake's men being seen in Colorado territory. Beatrice stiffened at the name. Blake, the cattle baron who had taken Wade's ranch in Texas. Sawyer blew out a stream of smoke. "Probably nothing. Blake's got enough land in Texas to keep him busy." "Probably," Wade agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. The conversation moved on to ranch matters, fences needing repair, a mare about to foal, the possibility of expanding their grazing land to the east. Beatrice listened, learning about the operations of the ranch she now called home. Eventually, Sawyer yawned and excused himself, leaving Beatrice and Wade alone on the porch. The night was clear, stars blanketing the sky in a display impossible to see from town. "You look well," Wade said after a comfortable silence. "Ranch life seems to agree with you," Beatrice smiled. "It does, surprisingly. I never imagined myself living so far from town, but there's a freedom here I never had in St. Elmo. And Emma hasn't driven you to despair yet, quite the opposite. She's brilliant, just needs the right approach." Beatrice hesitated, then added, "She talks about you constantly, you know. Wade says this and Wade showed me that. She adores you." A hint of color appeared on Wade's tan cheeks. "She's a good kid. Reminds me of my sister at that age, all questions and no fear." "You miss your family in Texas?" Beatrice asked gently. Wade's expression grew distant. "Every day. My sister writes when she can, but her husband doesn't approve of me much. Thinks I should have found a way to keep the ranch, no matter what it took." "That's unfair," Beatrice said, indignant on his behalf. Wade shrugged. "Maybe, but I've made my peace with it." He looked at her, his green eyes reflecting the porch lantern. "What about you? Do you miss St. Elmo at all?" Beatrice considered the question seriously. "I miss what it was before my mother died," she admitted. "The sense of community, having my own classroom." She touched her cheek, where the last faint yellow traces of bruising remained. "But I don't miss living in fear. I don't miss Vernon." Wade's jaw tightened at the mention of her stepfather. "Has there been any word?" "Nothing," Beatrice said. "Sawyer made inquiries in town last week discreetly through the sheriff. Apparently Vernon has told everyone I ran off with a traveling salesman." Wade snorted. "Better for his reputation than admitting he locked you in a cellar and declared you dead." "Much better," Beatrice agreed dryly, "though it means he's not actively searching for me, which is a relief." They fell silent again, the night sounds of the ranch, distant cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, a coyote's call from the hills creating a peaceful backdrop. "I thought about you," Wade said suddenly, the admission seeming to surprise even himself. "On the trail. Wondered how you were settling in." Beatrice's heart beat faster. "I thought about you too," she confessed. "The ranch feels different when you're here." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Wade moved slightly closer on the porch swing they shared. "Beatrice," he began, his voice lower than usual, "I know you came here under difficult circumstances, and the last thing you need is..." The sound of breaking glass from inside the house interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They both turned toward the noise, then heard Mrs. Finch's exasperated voice admonishing one of the house cats. The moment broken, Wade cleared his throat and stood. "It's late," he said, regret evident in his tone. "And you have teaching to do in the morning." Disappointment washed through Beatrice, but she nodded and rose as well. "Welcome home, Wade," she said softly, his eyes warmed at her choice of words. "Good night, Beatrice." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Beatrice replayed their conversation, wondering what Wade had been about to say before the interruption. The way he'd looked at her, moved closer to her, it suggested feelings beyond friendship, feelings that mirrored her own growing attachment. But was she ready for such feelings? She'd come to Castle Rock broken and frightened, her trust in men shattered by Vernon's cruelty. In the weeks since, she'd begun to rebuild herself, finding confidence as a teacher, making a place for herself at the ranch, learning to feel safe again. Wade was nothing like Vernon, she knew this with certainty. Where her stepfather had been manipulative and cruel, Wade was straightforward and kind. But the wounds Vernon had inflicted were still healing, and Beatrice wasn't sure if she was ready to risk her heart, no matter how worthy the man. As spring deepened into summer, life at Castle Rock settled into a pleasant routine. The schoolroom expanded to include 5 children from neighboring ranches, making Beatrice's mornings busy and fulfilling. In the afternoons, she often rode with Emma, exploring the ranch's vast acreage and learning about the land from the girls' enthusiastic perspective. Wade remained at the ranch, working closely with Sawyer on improving the cattle bloodlines and training horses. He and Beatrice circled each other cautiously, their friendship deepening, but neither quite ready to acknowledge the growing attraction between them. They shared meals, rode together when their duties allowed, and often found themselves lingering on the porch after others had retired, talking late into the night. During these conversations, Beatrice learned more about Wade's life before Castle Rock, his childhood on the Texas ranch, his brief time at a university in Austin before his father's death called him home, his struggles against Harrison Blake's relentless campaign to seize his land. In turn, she shared her own past, her happy childhood before her father's death, her education in the East, her return to Colorado to care for her ailing mother, and finally, the dark months under Vernon's roof. "I should have seen it sooner," she said one evening as they watched a summer storm roll across the distant mountains. "The way he isolated Mother controlled every aspect of her life. By the time I realized what was happening, she was too worn down to fight back." "Predators like Vernon are skilled at hiding their true nature," Wade said, his hand covering hers where it rested on the porch railing. "Don't blame yourself for his actions." The touch of his hand sent warmth up Beatrice's arm. Increasingly, these small physical connections, a hand at her back as they entered a room, fingers brushing as they reached for the same book, a steadying grip as she mounted her horse sent her heart racing. "I've been thinking," Wade said after a moment, "about taking a trip to St. Elmo." Beatrice turned to him, startled. "Why?" "To look into your mother's will. If it was properly filed, there should be legal recourse to reclaim your inheritance." The suggestion both touched and alarmed her. "That's very kind, but Vernon has connections with the local sheriff and bank. And if he discovered you were asking questions on my behalf?" "I know how to be discreet," Wade assured her, "and I have some experience with legal matters after my fight with Blake." Beatrice studied his determined expression. "Why would you do this for me?" Wade met her gaze steadily. "Because what he took from you matters, because you deserve justice." He paused, then added more softly, "And because I care what happens to you, Beatrice." The simple declaration made her breath catch. Before she could respond, the back door opened and Sawyer emerged, looking troubled. "Vance," he said, nodding acknowledgement to Beatrice. "Just got word from town. Sheriff wants to see us tomorrow morning." Wade straightened, instantly alert. "Problem?" Sawyer shrugged. "Messenger didn't say, just that it was important." He glanced between them. "Sorry to interrupt your evening." After he'd gone back inside, Wade turned to Beatrice. "I should turn in. Early start tomorrow." Though disappointed at the abrupt end to their conversation, Beatrice nodded. "Of course, I hope it's nothing serious." Wade hesitated, then impulsively took her hand and squeezed it. "We'll continue this discussion when I return." The following day passed slowly for Beatrice. With the children absorbed in their lessons, she couldn't help but wonder what had prompted the sheriff's summons. By mid-afternoon, when there was still no sign of Wade and Sawyer returning from town, her worry had grown considerably. "They're probably just having lunch at the hotel," Mrs. Finch reassured her, noticing Beatrice's frequent glances toward the window. Men never can resist Martha Jenkins' apple pie. But when the sun began to set and the men still hadn't returned, even Mrs. Finch looked concerned. "Should we send one of the hands to town?" Beatrice suggested as they prepared dinner. Mrs. Finch considered this. "Let's give them another hour. Silver Cliff isn't that far, but business can sometimes take longer than expected." Just as they were setting the table, the sound of horses approaching brought them both to the window. Sawyer and Wade rode into the yard, accompanied by a third man Beatrice didn't recognize. "Oh my, Mrs. Finch murmured. "That's Judge Hollister from Denver. Something serious must be happening." Beatrice's stomach tightened with anxiety. What business would a judge from Denver have at Castle Rock? The men dismounted and entered the house, their expressions grave. Judge Hollister was older than Sawyer, with a distinguished bearing and penetrating gray eyes that swept the room assessingly. "Mrs. Finch," Sawyer said, "would you mind taking Emma to the Carters for dinner? We need to have a private conversation." The housekeeper nodded, her face worried. "Of course, Mr. Sawyer. Come along, Emma," she called to the girl who had appeared in the doorway. "We're going to visit the Carters tonight." Once they had gone, Sawyer made introductions. "Judge William Hollister, this is Miss Beatrice Robertson, our teacher and bookkeeper." The judge inclined his head politely. "Miss Robertson, I understand you recently came to Colorado from St. Elmo." Alarm bells rang in Beatrice's mind. "That's correct, Your Honor. Please sit down," Sawyer said, gesturing to the dining table. "This concerns you directly, Beatrice." Heart pounding, she took a seat, Wade positioning himself beside her in what felt like a protective stance. Judge Hollister sat across from her, removing a document from his briefcase. "Miss Robertson, I've been appointed by the Territorial Court to investigate allegations of fraud and possible murder in St. Elmo, specifically involving one Vernon Robertson," Beatrice gasped. "Murder," the judge nodded gravely. "It seems your stepfather has been telling people you died of a fever. He's filed papers to that effect and has been liquidating property that, according to the county records, belongs to you under your mother's will." "But I'm obviously alive," Beatrice said, struggling to process this information. "Indeed," Judge Hollister agreed, "which makes his actions not only fraudulent but potentially much more serious if you had actually died as he claimed." He let the implication hang in the air. Wade's hand came to rest supportively on Beatrice's shoulder. "How did this investigation come about?" he asked. The judge glanced at Sawyer. "Your employer made some discreet inquiries that raised flags with Sheriff Hollister in Silver Cliff. The sheriff, being a conscientious man, contacted me directly rather than involving the St. Elmo authorities, given the connections Mr. Robertson apparently has there." Beatrice turned to Sawyer, surprised and touched that he had taken such steps on her behalf. "Wade mentioned your situation," Sawyer explained. "Thought it wasn't right what happened to you, so I made some inquiries." "What happens now?" Beatrice asked, looking back to the judge. "That depends largely on you, Miss Robertson. I have the authority to issue a warrant for Vernon Robertson's arrest on charges of fraud. If you're willing to testify about the circumstances of your departure from St. Elmo, we could potentially add charges of assault and attempted murder." The prospect of facing Vernon again, of publicly recounting her ordeal, made Beatrice's mouth go dry with fear. But beneath that fear was a steely determination. Vernon had taken everything from her: her home, her mother's possessions, her security. He had expected her to disappear or die quietly. She would not give him that satisfaction. "I will testify," she said firmly. Wade's hand tightened briefly on her shoulder. "You won't face him alone," he said quietly. Judge Hollister nodded approvingly. "Good. I'll need your formal statement tonight, and then we'll proceed with the arrest tomorrow. Sheriff Hollister from Silver Cliff will handle it personally, along with deputies from my office in Denver. Your stepfather's connections in St. Elmo won't help him." As the judge began preparing documents for her statement, Beatrice felt a curious lightness, as if a burden she'd been carrying for months had begun to lift. Vernon would face justice. She might recover her inheritance. Most importantly, she would no longer need to look over her shoulder, wondering if he was searching for her. Wade stayed by her side throughout the evening as she provided her statement to Judge Hollister, his presence a steady anchor as she recounted Vernon's escalating cruelty after her mother's death, his theft of her inheritance, and finally, the terrifying night he had locked her in the cellar, intending for her to die there. "And you escaped through a window," the judge prompted, making notes. "Yes. It was small, designed for ventilation, not exit, but I managed to force the frame and squeeze through." Beatrice unconsciously rubbed her arms, remembering the scrapes and bruises from that desperate flight. When the statement was complete and Judge Hollister had retired to the guest room Sawyer provided, Wade walked Beatrice to the porch, sensing her need for fresh air and quiet. "You did well," he said as they stood looking out at the star-filled sky. "That took courage." "I don't feel particularly courageous," Beatrice admitted. "Part of me is terrified at the thought of seeing Vernon again, of having to stand in court and speak about what happened." "That's what makes it brave," Wade said simply, "doing what's right despite your fear." Beatrice looked up at him, this quiet man who had become so important to her in such a short time. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for bringing me here, for encouraging Sawyer to make inquiries, for staying with me tonight." Wade's expression softened. "I told you once that I know what it's like to have everything taken away. What I didn't say was how much I wish someone had fought for me when I was losing my ranch." He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wanted, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You deserved someone to fight for you, Beatrice." The tenderness of the gesture, combined with his words, made her heart swell with emotion. Without overthinking, she stepped closer and rested her head against his chest. After a moment's surprise, Wade's arms came around her, holding her gently. They stood like that for a long time, the steady beat of his heart against her ear more comforting than any words could have been. In his embrace, Beatrice found not just security but a sense of possibility, a future beyond survival, beyond recovery, where happiness might truly be within reach again. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Judge Hollister returned to Denver, and within a week, word came that Vernon had been arrested without incident. The charges against him were serious: fraud, theft, assault, and attempted murder. Given the evidence, including Beatrice's sworn statement and documents Vernon had falsified declaring her dead, the judge expected the case to proceed swiftly. "He's demanding to see you," Sheriff Hollister reported when he visited Castle Rock to update them. "Claims there's been a misunderstanding, that he thought you had run away and assumed you dead when you didn't return." "A convenient explanation," Wade said dryly, his protective stance beside Beatrice now a familiar, welcome presence. The sheriff nodded. Judge Hollister wasn't impressed either, especially given the cellar window Miss Robertson described, which showed clear signs of having been forced from the inside. "Will I need to testify at a trial?" Beatrice asked, dreading the prospect. "Possibly," the sheriff admitted. "Though the evidence is strong enough that he might accept a plea rather than face a jury. Either way, it'll be several weeks before anything is decided." As the sheriff prepared to leave, he handed Beatrice an envelope. "Almost forgot. Judge Hollister asked me to give you this. It's a temporary injunction preventing the sale of any property from your mother's estate while the case is pending." Beatrice accepted the document with trembling hands. It represented the first step toward reclaiming what was rightfully hers: her mother's house, her possessions, her independence. "What will you do?" Wade asked later as they walked along the creek that bordered the eastern edge of Castle Rock. "If you recover your inheritance," it was a question Beatrice had been pondering herself. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I could return to St. Elmo, reopen Mother's house. Perhaps teach at the school again." The prospect should have been appealing, regaining everything she had lost, yet the thought of leaving Castle Rock, leaving Emma and Sawyer and Mrs. Finch, leaving Wade, created an ache in her chest. "Is that what you want?" Wade's voice was carefully neutral. Beatrice stopped walking and turned to face him. "No," she said honestly, "it isn't." Something flickered in Wade's eyes, hope, perhaps. "What do you want, Beatrice?" The directness of the question took her breath away. For so long, her focus had been on survival, on rebuilding from nothing. Wants and desires had seemed like luxuries she couldn't afford. But now, standing beside the creek with Wade looking at her as if her answer meant everything, Beatrice allowed herself to acknowledge what her heart had known for weeks. "I want to stay," she said softly, "here at Castle Rock. With Emma and the other children, she hesitated, then gathered her courage. "With you, Wade." The confession hung between them, vulnerable and real. Wade stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because the thought of you leaving has been driving me half crazy." Beatrice's heart soared. "Really?" Instead of answering with words, Wade closed the remaining distance between them. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing lightly over skin that was now fully healed. Then, with exquisite gentleness, he lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was soft at first, a question more than a demand. Beatrice answered by sliding her hands up his chest and into his hair, drawing him closer. Wade responded with a sound low in his throat, deepening the kiss as his arms encircled her waist. When they finally parted, both breathless, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" Beatrice asked, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Because you deserved time," Wade said simply. "Time to heal, to find your footing again. I didn't want to rush you or make you feel pressured in any way." The consideration behind his restraint touched her deeply. This was what made Wade so different from Vernon, this fundamental respect for her autonomy, her choices. "And now?" she asked, searching his face. "Now," Wade said, his smile slow and warm, "I'm hoping you'll let me court you properly, Miss Robertson. With Sawyer's approval, of course, since you're under his roof." The formal request, so at odds with the passion of their kiss moments before, made Beatrice laugh. "I would like that very much, Mr. Vance." They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, the future suddenly bright with promise. Autumn came to Castle Rock in a blaze of gold and crimson as the aspen trees turned, and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter. Vernon's case had progressed as expected, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy prison term. He had accepted a plea agreement that required full restitution of Beatrice's inheritance, along with a 5-year sentence for his crimes. "The house in St. Elmo is legally yours again," Judge Hollister informed Beatrice during a visit to the ranch. "As are all your mother's possessions that remain. Unfortunately, Vernon sold quite a bit before his arrest." "It doesn't matter," Beatrice said, surprised to find she meant it. The house in St. Elmo represented her past a life before Vernon's betrayal, before her flight, before Wade. "I plan to sell the property. My life is here now." Her life at Castle Rock had indeed flourished. The small schoolroom had grown to accommodate 12 students, with Sawyer adding a second room to the building over the summer. Beatrice's teaching had expanded to include not just the ranch children, but also several adults ranch hands eager to improve their reading and arithmetic skills. And even Mrs. Finch, who had shyly requested help with her writing so she could correspond more effectively with her sister in Missouri. And then there was Wade. True to his word, he had courted her with old-fashioned propriety that both amused and touched Beatrice. Flowers gathered from the mountainsides appeared on her desk. Rides to Silver Cliff for ice cream at the new parlor became a weekend tradition. Evenings on the porch stretched longer as they shared hopes and dreams under starlit skies. "I've been thinking," Wade said on one such evening in late October, a woolen blanket draped around their shoulders against the autumn chill. "About the future." Beatrice leaned into his warmth. "What about it?" Wade was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "When I lost my ranch in Texas, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I'd never own land again, never put down roots." He turned slightly to look at her. "But lately, I've been reconsidering." "Because of your work with Sawyer?" Beatrice asked, thinking of how Wade had helped expand Castle Rock's operations over the past months. "Partly," Wade admitted, "but mostly because of you." Beatrice's heart quickened. "Me?" Wade took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "There's a parcel of land bordering Castle Rock to the east, good grazing land with a creek running through it. Sawyer mentioned the owners looking to sell." "You're thinking of buying it?" Beatrice asked, beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. Wade nodded. "With the money from your St. Elmo property and what I've saved working for Sawyer." He trailed off, then took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you would consider building a future there, with me, as my wife." Though they had been moving steadily toward this moment for months, the actual proposal still took Beatrice's breath away. "Wade, I know it's not as grand as what you had in St. Elmo," he said quickly. "And it would be starting from nothing. We'd need to build a house, establish a herd." "Yes," Beatrice interrupted, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Yes, I will marry you, Wade Vance." Relief and happiness transformed Wade's face. He cupped her cheek, searching her eyes. "You're sure?" It won't be easy, starting over like this. Beatrice smiled, thinking of how far they had both come, she from the terrified woman fleeing in the night, he from the rancher who had lost everything. I started over with nothing but hope the day you found me by that stream, she said softly. Everything since then has been a gift I never expected. She placed her hand over his heart. This land, this life we'll build together, it's more than I ever dreamed possible after Vernon. Wade drew her closer, his kiss tender yet filled with promise. I love you, Beatrice Robertson, he whispered against her lips. Have almost from the first moment I saw you, brave and defiant despite everything you'd been through. And I love you, Wade Vance, she replied, her heart overflowing, for seeing me at my worst and believing in my best. They were married on Christmas Day, 1882, in the Castle Rock main house decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. Emma served as Beatrice's attendant, solemn with the responsibility until the moment she broke into giggles while presenting the rings. Judge Hollister performed the ceremony, having traveled from Denver despite winter roads, declaring it the happiest duty of my judicial career. Sawyer gave the bride away, whispering as he placed Beatrice's hand in Wade's, "You two deserve every happiness. But don't think this means I'm letting you both leave Castle Rock entirely. We need our teacher and our foreman." Indeed, their arrangement with Sawyer continued even as they established their own ranch on the neighboring land. Wade managed both properties with the help of the Carter brothers, while Beatrice maintained her teaching position at Castle Rock, riding the short distance each morning on Daisy, now her permanent mount. Construction on their house began in spring 1883, a modest but sturdy structure with large windows to capture the mountain views and a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the peaks. "It's perfect," Beatrice declared when the final piece of furniture, a rocking chair Wade had crafted himself during the winter evenings, was placed near the hearth. "Not quite," Wade said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "One last thing." Curious, Beatrice unwrapped it to find a brass plaque, its surface gleaming in the firelight. Engraved upon it were the words, "Vance Ranch, EST, 1883 from Hope Everything." Tears sprang to Beatrice's eyes as she traced the letters. "Oh, Wade." "To remind us," he said, his own voice thick with emotion, "that no matter what happens, no matter what challenges come, we started with nothing but hope and built this life together." The plaque was mounted beside their front door, a daily reminder of their journey and the promise of their future. That future expanded in February 1884 with the birth of their son, James Howard Vance, named for Wade's father and Sawyer, who accepted the honor of godfather with uncharacteristic emotion. Emma appointed herself the baby's official protector, reading to him daily from her schoolbooks, so he'll be smart like his mama. Life on the frontier remained challenging: harsh winters, occasional drought, the constant work of maintaining a ranch. Yet Beatrice found these challenges entirely different from the crushing oppression she had experienced under Vernon's roof. Each difficulty faced with Wade became not a burden, but a shared opportunity to prove their resilience. By the summer of 1885, Vance Ranch had expanded to include 50 head of cattle, a small but productive vegetable garden, and 3 horses besides Midnight and Daisy. The house had grown too, with the addition of a second bedroom and a larger kitchen where Beatrice experimented with recipes Mrs. Finch taught her, on the evening of their 3rd wedding anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching 2-year-old James toddle after fireflies in the yard. Beatrice reached for Wade's hand. "I have a gift for you," she said, smiling mysteriously. Wade raised an eyebrow. "Better than the new saddle I gave you this morning," Beatrice laughed. "Different, certainly." She placed his hand gently on her stomach. "In about 7 months, James will have a brother or sister." Wade's expression transformed from confusion to wonder. "Really?" he whispered, his hand splaying protectively over the place where their second child grew. "Beatrice, that's wonderful." As he gathered her into his arms, kissing her with joy and tenderness, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the desperate flight from St. Elmo, with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's ring, to this moment of complete happiness, it seemed almost impossible, yet entirely right. "What are you thinking?" Wade asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about hope," Beatrice said softly. "How it can sustain you through the darkest times, how it can lead you to places you never imagined." Wade nodded, understanding completely as he always did. "From hope, everything," he quoted from their plaque, pulling her close as they watched their son chase the glowing insects across the yard they had built together from nothing but dreams and determination. Their daughter, Catherine Elizabeth Vance, arrived in July 1886, a sturdy baby with Wade's green eyes and Beatrice's dark hair. James, now an important 3-year-old, took his role as big brother seriously, bringing his favorite wooden horse to protect his sister's cradle. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and growth. The ranch prospered under Wade's careful management, while Beatrice continued teaching at Castle Rock, now with Catherine bundled beside her desk, and James proudly sitting among the older students during his lessons. Vernon Robertson was released from prison in 1887, a fact communicated by Judge Hollister, with assurances that the former stepfather had been ordered to stay away from Beatrice and her family. They heard through Silver Cliff Sheriff that Vernon had left Colorado entirely, heading for California with whatever remained of his ill-gotten gains. "Are you worried?" Wade asked when the news arrived. Beatrice considered the question, searching her heart for any lingering fear. "No," she said finally, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Vernon is part of my past, not my future." Her future was here in the home she and Wade had built, in the children they were raising, in the community they had become part of. Vernon had once taken everything she owned, but in doing so, he had inadvertently set her on the path to finding everything she needed. On a warm autumn evening in 1890, as Beatrice and Wade sat on their porch watching 7-year-old James teach 4-year-old Catherine to rope a fence post, a rider approached from the direction of Castle Rock. "Letter for you, Mrs. Vance," called Thomas Carter, now Sawyer's head ranch hand. From back east, by the looks of it. Beatrice accepted the envelope, noting the Connecticut postmark with surprise. Opening it, she found a letter from Miss Porter's school, her alma mater, responding to an inquiry she had sent months earlier. "What does it say?" Wade asked, noting her widening smile as she read. "They're interested," Beatrice said, excitement rising in her voice, "in my proposal for a scholarship fund for Western girls who otherwise couldn't afford such an education." She looked up at her husband, eyes shining. "They think it's a worthy cause and would be honored to establish the Alina Robertson Memorial Scholarship." Wade squeezed her hand. "Your mother would be proud," he said quietly, "using your inheritance this way." The final portion of Beatrice's recovered funds from the St. Elmo property had arrived that spring. Rather than adding it to their ranch savings, she had proposed this memorial to her mother, a way to ensure other young women had the educational opportunities that had been so valuable in her own life. "It feels right," Beatrice said, watching as James successfully demonstrated a perfect throw for his sister. "Mother always believed education was the one thing that couldn't be taken away from you." Wade nodded, his arm coming around her shoulders. "She was a wise woman." "I wish I could have known her. She would have liked you," Beatrice said confidently. "She always said the measure of a man was how he treated those who had nothing to offer him." She leaned into his embrace. "You measure up rather well, Wade Vance." He chuckled, dropping a kiss on her head. "I'm just a simple cowboy who recognized a treasure when he found one." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting their land in gold and amber, Beatrice reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment. From the terrified young woman fleeing in the night with nothing but a ring and desperate hope, to this, a woman with a home, a family, purpose, and love. Vernon had indeed taken everything she owned, but in the process, he had sent her toward the one man who would help her build something far more precious than anything she had lost. "What are you thinking about so intently?" Wade asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Beatrice smiled, watching their children's laughter as they played in the yard of the home built from nothing but determination and love. "I'm thinking that sometimes," she said softly. "Losing everything can lead you exactly where you're meant to be." Wade's eyes, still as green and kind as they had been that first morning by the stream, filled with understanding. "From hope, everything," he murmured, the words that had become their family motto. "From hope, everything," Beatrice agreed, turning her face up to his kiss as the first stars appeared in the Colorado sky above the life they had created together.